Hi debaters, this is a topic lecture series on the 2026-2027 National Health Insurance topic brought to you by Michigan State University. My name is Maggie Berthiaume and I'm Director of Debate at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. This year's resolution asks whether the United States federal government should establish national health insurance. This is a significant issue that has been debated for years and it carries profound implications for every American. This lecture will be in 3 parts. The first part will be about the status quo and how we got there, briefly reviewing the history of healthcare in the United States and how the current system works. We'll then look at the problems with the status quo that might become advantage areas for the affirmative. The second video will review the major affirmative proposals that support establishing national health insurance. And then the final video will introduce the major negative arguments, which highlight concerns such as economic impact and government overreach. It's crucial to understand both sides to be prepared for the season ahead. I've given a lot of topic lectures, and it's one of my favorite ways to prepare for a season. But in some ways, topic lectures shouldn't exist, or at least they should be very quickly obsolete. It's impossible to predict all of the ways a topic will develop, and if we could teach you everything you needed to know in a short video series, it wouldn't be a very good topic for a season long of debates. I hope by the beginning of the season, you'd be able to give your own topic lecture that would include lots of things that aren't included here. That would mean you're doing a very good job getting ready for debate. In this video, we will dive into the status quo and how we've arrived at this point in our healthcare system. We will begin by considering the current conditions and historical factors that have shaped them. The status quo is not just a snapshot of the present, it's a culmination of decisions, policies, and societal changes that have led us here. That sets the stage for comprehending the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead in this season long of debates. Before we delve into the specific history of health insurance in the United States, it's useful to see just how much of an outlier the U.S. is among our peer countries. This is a map of the world. All of the green countries have national health insurance. A huge part of why national health insurance has been a perennial issue in American politics is that we are just so different than other democracies in this one area. So let's find out how that happened by looking at the history of health insurance in the U.S. During the pre-industrial era, the landscape of medicine was vastly different from what we know today. First, the U.S. was not a leader in medicine. That was happening in other parts of the world. Also, medicine was not yet a structured profession, and there were no established medical schools to train physicians. This lack of formal education meant that medical practices were based on tradition rather than scientific evidence. The treatments available during this time were rudimentary at best. The so-called cures were often ineffective and sometimes even harmful. These remedies were based more on folklore than on any scientific understanding of disease. This era laid the groundwork for transformation in healthcare and set the stage for future advancements that we'll explore next. The post-industrial era saw the emergence of health insurance as a concept. This was a groundbreaking moment that provided a safety net for individuals and families, marking the onset of a more organized approach to healthcare access. This innovation stemmed from a different type of insurance, workers' compensation, commonly known as workers' comp. This is a program that offers payments to individuals injured on the job, covering healthcare expenses and often compensating them for lost wages. The Great Depression was a particularly challenging time for those facing illness, as many people could not afford care. Baylor University Hospital in Texas recognized that teachers were among those most likely to default on payments. They devised a plan where teachers would contribute 50 cents a month to cover potential hospital stays. This was called Blue Cross. Blue Cross became the pioneering insurance company and notably operated as a nonprofit. That meant that any excess funds collected in a given year would be reinvested into future claims rather than distributed to owners or shareholders. 13 years later, this fledgling model saw significant expansion as Congress restricted employers' ability to raise wages during World War II. Consequently, employers began to compete for workers based on benefits instead of salaries. Alongside this rise of private insurance through the worker's employer, there was a considerable movement advocating for national health insurance. The goal was to establish healthcare as a right for all rather than a privilege for a select few. This initiative ignited important discussions and laid the foundation for future healthcare reforms. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt argued in a State of the Union address that access to medical care should be regarded as a right. However, this proposal did not succeed, and health insurance in the U.S. remained predominantly private rather than public. The next major development of this period was the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid. These programs were revolutionary, offering healthcare coverage for seniors and low-income individuals respectively, and have since become fundamental components of the American healthcare system. By the 1960s, private health insurance had grown significantly, yet it was evident that certain segments of the population were still excluded. The health insurance debates of the early 1960s featured advocates calling for government care for older and disabled Americans, while groups like the American Medical Association contended that government-run healthcare would undermine the doctor-patient relationship. In 1965, Medicare and Medicaid were established under the Social Security Act. In the years that have followed, both programs have undergone numerous modifications aimed at controlling rising costs. These developments played a crucial role in shaping the healthcare landscape we recognize today and set the stage for subsequent reforms. By the late 1970s, the landscape for health insurance was becoming more private. This period saw the rise of health maintenance organizations, or HMOs, which introduced a new model for managing healthcare services. Under an HMO plan, patients can only see specialists after consulting their primary care doctor. Also during this time, for-profit insurance companies became more prevalent, changing the way healthcare was funded and accessed. No longer would excess funds be reinvested into benefits. Finally, in the early days of his presidency, Bill Clinton attempted to create national health insurance. Called Hillary Care because it was managed by his wife and future U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, it attempted to create universal coverage using private means. However, the political fight was much more difficult than expected, and national healthcare reform attempts were scrapped for almost 20 years. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, became a significant milestone in the U.S. healthcare system. It was designed to make healthcare more accessible and affordable for millions of Americans. One of the major goals of the ACA was to reduce the number of uninsured individuals by expanding coverage options. The Act introduced several reforms intended to improve the quality of healthcare and curb the rising costs associated with medical care. Like the Hillary Care proposal, it was a liberal goal of universal coverage combined with a conservative mechanism via private insurance companies. Let's dive into the primary features of the ACA. First is the individual mandate. This required most Americans to have health insurance or pay a penalty, ensuring a broader insurance pool. Next, we have the employer mandate, which mandated that businesses with over 50 full-time employees must provide health insurance to their workers. The Medicaid expansion is another cornerstone, extending coverage to millions more low-income individuals. This was crucial in reducing the uninsured rate, although its actual effects have been blunted, as we will see shortly. Additionally, the ACA introduced essential benefits that cannot be capped or limited for pre-existing conditions, ideally guaranteeing comprehensive coverage for all. Previously, a person who didn't have health insurance but did have a condition like diabetes or even something like eczema could be denied coverage, or that condition itself would not be coverage. This could be disastrous for individuals who lost their jobs and thus also lost their employer-provided coverage. Also under the ACA, young adults can stay on their parents' insurance plans until age 26, a feature that provides significant peace of mind for families. And insurers are required to spend at least 80% of premium dollars on medical care and quality improvements rather than administrative costs. Finally, the ACA created exchanges, which were a marketplace for individuals to compare and purchase insurance plans. But within hours of the passage of the ACA, the first lawsuits were filed against it. And in the 16 years since, significant portions of the ACA have been eliminated or substantially limited. We will review a few of these to briefly understand where national health insurance stands today. Let's begin with the individual mandate. Insurance companies loved it because the individual mandate requires everyone to have health insurance or face a penalty. This mandate ensured a broad insurance pool, balancing out the risk with more healthy individuals contributing to the system. Previously, insurance companies worried that only those with significant health conditions would seek coverage. On the other hand, many Republicans in Congress opposed it. They viewed the mandate as an overreach of federal power, compelling individuals to buy a product whether they wanted it or not. This opposition was a significant point of contention in the ACA debates. The individual mandate faced a legal challenge in the landmark Supreme Court case NFIB v. Sebelius in 2012. The court upheld the mandate, but as a tax, not a penalty. This decision was pivotal in maintaining the structure of the ACA. But in 2017, the mandate faced a different kind of attack. Its effectiveness was effectively neutralized when Congress zeroed out the penalty as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This move significantly altered the landscape of the ACA and its implementation. There is still technically an individual mandate, but there is no penalty for violating it. Another major part of the Affordable Care Act's broader aim to increase healthcare access was the Medicaid expansion. Medicaid originally restricted its reach to certain low-income groups, like those with children. These constraints meant that many individuals in need were left without coverage. It was simply not enough to be low income. In the same Supreme Court case that saved the individual mandate, the court ruled that states did not have to expand Medicaid to get Medicaid funds. This allowed states to opt out, leading to a patchwork of coverage across the country. Despite the initial push for nationwide expansion, 10 states have remained holdouts, declining to adopt the expansion even to this day. You can see them in green on this map here. Finally, let's touch on the work requirements. These are scheduled for the end of 2027. The Trump administration enacted requirements on receiving Medicaid. These proposed requirements could potentially limit access for many beneficiaries, raising concerns about the future inclusivity of Medicaid. ACA marketplaces have been a pivotal part of improving access to health insurance through the bill. If someone says they have an Obamacare plan, they mean that they got insurance on the ACA marketplace. This is the primary way that Americans who don't have employer-sponsored health insurance can get coverage. States have the option to run their own marketplaces or use the federal platform at healthcare.gov. This choice affects local control and customization, leading to varied consumer experiences between different states. During the early days of COVID, the federal government put in place enhanced subsidies to help people afford marketplace plans. These subsidies aim to make premiums more affordable, especially for middle-income individuals who might not qualify for traditional assistance. Unfortunately for the goal of universal coverage, those enhanced subsidies expired at the end of 2025. You might remember the government shutdown in October and November. That was about these subsidies, but the shutdown ended without a deal. As a result, the cost for plans in the marketplace has almost doubled between 2025 and 2026, putting health insurance out of the range of many. One of the biggest challenges before the ACA was how insurance companies handled so-called pre-existing conditions. If someone had a serious health issue and they lost their job, they could end up losing access to meaningful health insurance altogether. Even a short gap in coverage while they search for a new job could create huge problems. For example, imagine someone undergoing cancer treatment who loses their job. Before the ACA, if they had a lapse in coverage, a new insurance plan could refuse to cover anything related to their cancer going forward, even if they later got a new job with health benefits. The same issue affected people who were covered under a spouse's insurance plan. In the event of a divorce, they could lose their coverage and then have a very difficult time finding a new plan that would insure them at an affordable price or sometimes even at all. The ACA also changed how insurance companies could set prices based on someone's health. Before the law passed, people with conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure were often charged much higher premiums simply because they were considered high risk. In some cases, insurance companies would refuse to cover them altogether. Another major problem was that some insurers would cancel a person's policy after they became seriously sick or hospitalized. Companies would look back through a patient's medical history, searching for anything they had claimed that hadn't been disclosed, sometimes something just as minor as acne, a common cold, or poison oak, and use it as a reason to deny coverage retroactively. The ACA designed to put an end to these practices. The ACA also cracked down on what many people call junk insurance plans. These are plans that look affordable at first, but they provide very limited coverage and are full of loopholes. For example, a plan might cover basic doctor visits but not hospital stays, or it might cap coverage at an amount far too low to handle a serious issue or emergency. After the ACA passed, these types of plans were mostly banned, especially through the ACA marketplace, because they didn't meet the law's minimum coverage standards. But over time, many of them have returned outside the marketplace. As ACA premiums have increased, especially after subsidies ended in late 2025, more people are drawn to these cheaper alternatives. The problem is that junk plans can be really hard to spot. They are often marketed to look like real health insurance, even though they may not provide coverage at all. Researchers have warned that these plans can leave people underinsured while pulling healthier people out of the ACA market, which drives up costs for everyone else. So, did the ACA work? Well, the ACA did not achieve universal coverage for all Americans, not even close. That's why national health insurance can still be the debate topic 16 years later. It also fell short of what some healthcare advocates had hoped for when it came to reducing the role of insurance companies. During the ACA negotiation, proposals for a single-payer system, where the government would handle healthcare coverage directly instead of relying on private insurance companies, were considered, but ultimately rejected. As a result, the ACA kept the existing multi-payer system largely in place, along with all of the complexity that comes with it. On the other hand, it did have some successes. About 20 million Americans gained coverage. The under 26 rule was especially effective. 3 million more young people gained insurance. Most Americans have stuck with their employer-provided plan, but they did have a fallback on the marketplace if they were unemployed or worked for a small business. And 16 million people gained benefits through the Medicaid expansion. So, post-ACA, the U.S. is still left with many problems with the status quo relating to healthcare that we'll be debating this year. The biggest problem with American healthcare in 2026 is the costs. We pay about twice as much per person as other high-income countries, yet we don't get more care for those costs. Americans actually see the doctor less than our peers do. A January 2026 poll found that 66% of Americans were somewhat or very worried about affording healthcare for their family. That compares with 52% with the same concerns about housing or gas. Private programs are especially pricey. Individuals with private insurance, like through the ACA marketplace or their employer, pay more for almost every service than those with Medicare or Medicaid. People who study economics often wonder why competition doesn't do a better job of lowering healthcare costs in the U.S. According to some economic theories, insurance companies and hospitals should compete to offer the best care at the best price. But healthcare doesn't work like a normal market. Doctors and hospitals have far more information than patients, making it hard for people to judge which treatments or providers are actually better. On top of that, many major medical decisions happen during stressful moments, like after a car accident or a scary diagnosis, when patients aren't realistically able to shop around and compare prices. As a result, consumers can't make informed choices the way they can in other areas. Another major problem is access. About 26 million Americans are uninsured. They don't have coverage at all. The uninsured problem is also somewhat deceptive, as many people cycle in and out of coverage. For example, this month, about 12% of Americans don't have health insurance. But in the next 2 years, about 1 in 4 Americans, or 25%, won't have health insurance for at least some period. That's because people get a job, get insurance, then get laid off and lose their insurance over and over. Another healthcare issue that often gets overlooked is called underinsurance, when people technically have health insurance, but they still can't afford the care they need. This has become a growing problem, with about 1 in 4 Americans considered underinsured in 2024. About half of Americans currently get health insurance through their employer or a spouse's employer. That can create what's called job lock, where people stay in jobs that they want to leave because they can't afford to lose their insurance. Ironically, this problem has actually gotten worse in recent years. It also means that people can lose their health coverage right when they become too sick to keep working and need care the most. Finally, let's look at health outcomes. One argument you might hear is that the U.S. health system is only more expensive because it delivers better results. But in reality, Americans generally have worse health outcomes than many people in other wealthy countries. Life expectancy in the U.S. is lower than in places like Japan, France, and Germany, and health outcomes are especially poor for low-income communities, rural areas, and many racial minorities. COVID-19 exposed major weaknesses in the system, with Americans dying at much higher rates than people in similar countries like Canada. At the end of part 1, we'll take a look at the impacts. Inadequate health systems can profoundly affect various aspects of our society and lives. First is inequality. The American system is profoundly unequal, including along lines of race, gender, sexual identity, and other societal injustices. Some affirmatives are likely to have advantages in this area. A rights-based argument says that healthcare should be treated as a basic human right rather than a privilege tied to employment or income. International organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization describe healthcare access, affordability, and quality as core human rights. Supporters of national health insurance often argue that universal coverage is necessary for people to live with dignity and fully exercise other rights. Another common argument for national health insurance is that uninsured or underinsured people are much less likely to seek treatment during pandemic outbreaks, which can allow those diseases to spread more widely. Recent research on COVID-19 found that states and countries with higher uninsured rates also tended to have higher fatality rates. Other studies suggest that expanding access to care, through Medicaid, can reduce the transmission and mortality by making pandemics easier for people to get treatment early. Another argument is that America's healthcare system hurts the country economically. Employer-provided insurance is expensive, and those costs can make it harder for U.S. companies to raise wages or compete internationally. At the same time, poorer overall health in the U.S. workforce lowers productivity, increases business costs, and weakens economic growth. Researchers describe this broader problem as the U.S. health disadvantage. Some arguments connect national health insurance to military strength and global power. Poor health among Americans has limited military recruitment, with many young people being ineligible for service because of chronic health issues. Advocates argue that improving population health through broader insurance coverage could strengthen military readiness and help the U.S. maintain its global influence, similar to how past great powers invested in public health to preserve economic and military strength. A final argument here relates to the system of capitalism in the U.S. and says that employer-based health insurance gives employers far too much control over the lives of Americans. This has profound impacts on every element of society. This is the end of the first video in this series. The next video will discuss affirmative arguments on the topic. Happy debating!